Honestly, I didn't burn. I didn't burn. I can do my session actually, but I can check on it. I always worry that on the screen. There's an I know.
We cleaned up.
Isn't that it?
I'll say. I have 37. I just look at it like that.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Oh, I thought I was gonna. So we're gonna get started with the autonomic nervous system and an overview of our nervous system in a second. But just wanted to congratulate you all. Exam looked way better this time. Both the mean and median were in the B range, hovering at about an 82. The most common grade, the mode, was a 94 on this exam. So congratulations, really good work. That said, some of you are still having trouble, and I still want you to succeed in this course. So if that describes you, I've spoken to some of you, but let's make sure that we meet during my office hours. You can find a link to book that on Brightspace, or if those times don't work for you, we can arrange something else. We can kind of go through how you're studying and your specific materials and see if I can pinpoint kind of where we're going wrong. I can also recommend asking the SI leaders or our TAs for any of the lab sections what their personal strategies were for succeeding in this course. They've taken this course relatively recently. They did well, that's why we picked them. So they might have some tips for you really, really specifically, since when I took this course, it was a different place and different professors. You some of you have seen an adjustment in your grade recently. I noticed that the extra credit question was only coming in as 1 point, should be 3. So I went and pushed that through. So your grade might have gone up a couple points. All right. So that said, we're gonna rip on into our autonomic nervous system, unless there are any questions here. Okay, so we're going to be moving from our cellular understanding of how an action potential works, how those membrane potential works, how we have that level of signaling, starting to think about, okay, so how do we get these signals out from our brain, out to the rest of the body? How do we get signals coming back? So we're going to be looking at big picture nervous system stuff now. And then we're going to be taking a look at where those signals are going. So we're going to start thinking about things like muscles and plants. So before we do that, I want to make sure we know where we are. I'm on this one, but not on yours, so that's fine. All right. So this is a pretty comprehensive image of how we can split up different parts of our nervous system when we're describing them. So I'm going to run us through the picture before we talk about the specific words on here. So what we're looking at, okay, we have our big control for the whole system, our central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord. This is where your thinking happens, your reflexes get processed, information gets processed. This is the control system. But in order to control something, we have to have information coming in. We've got to have information going out. So that's the job of your peripheral nervous system. So the periphery, like your peripheral vision out to the sides, it's going to be any nerves that are located in places like your arms, your gut, your legs, anywhere that's not the brain and spinal cord. Now, that's where we start to kind of divide more carefully what types of nerves we're talking about. Okay? So there are a number of different ways we can think about those nerves out in the periphery. So one way is that we can think about what direction that information is traveling. Right? So when we talked about maintenance of homeostasis, we talked about the fact that we have like signals and stimuli coming in to our integrator, and then we have signals going out to our effector organs. This is where we're zooming in on that stuff. Right? So one of the first ways we'll divide the nervous system is into a sensory afferent division. So afferent starting with a capital A, coming in. So that's talking about the direction of the fibers coming in. Right, so if you do one of those reflex tests where you bang on your kneecap with a hammer and you kick, right? Feeling that stretch, right? That sense coming from your kneecap, that tendon going towards your spinal cord, that would be your afferent nerve, the afferent division. You'd have the reaction in the central nervous system kind of planned out, then that motor command to actually do the kick is part of the efferent division. So efferent or motor doesn't always refer to what you think of in day-to-day life as muscle. Motor just really means going out for our purposes when we're thinking about the nervous system. So the efferent division is talking about signals coming from your central nervous system, going out to somewhere, traveling on those nerves in your peripheral nervous system. Right. So afferent fibers we can think of as sensory, sensing things. Efferent fibers we can think of as motor, creating reactions. Okay. Other words here, right? So we're transmitting information to the central nervous system. This word visceral, you may not have seen before. The word viscera is a fancy word for organs, basically. So the visceral receptors would be like receptors for sensing things out in your different organ systems. This is important for maintaining homeostasis because if we want to maintain something like our body temperature, we need to know what temperature our body is right now. We need to know what the temperature of a room is potentially, right? If we want to maintain our blood pressure, we need to have receptors somewhere that sense that, right? And all that information has to come into the central nervous system. So that's the job of those afferent fibers. The efferent fibers are going out. Okay. We generally refer to them as motor fibers. This is where we're going to have another split. Okay. So efferent fibers are always the ones going out, but we can get more specific than that. Okay. So our efferent division going out here is going to include two new groups, right? So if we're going to skeletal muscle, so say you're going to your biceps and your arm, right? That's part of the somatic nervous system. So if you're telling a named muscle that you might see in the anatomy lab to contract, bend, move your body, that's somatic. Soma, like a soma of a neuron was like the body of that cell. Somatic, we're thinking about skeletal muscle. But we have a more kind of secretive part of the nervous system that is really important for maintaining those things that we don't consciously think about. Right? So things that we don't consciously think about, like our heart rate, our breathing rate, our blood pressure, they still are controlled by your brain, by your nervous system, by all these nerves. But those nerves are located in their own division. So this autonomic nervous system is our sort of contrast to the somatic nervous system. And so somatic nerve, you think about it, you'd say, oh, I want to move my arm, right? Somatic nerve. But if you want to change your heart rate, you're not going to think like, oh, let me speed up my heart. That would be your autonomic nervous system adjusting your heart rate. And the autonomic nervous system within it is going to have two sections. We're going to dive deep into those today, but we're going to have a sympathetic division and we're going to have a parasympathetic division. And they're going to work together, kind of like a dimmer switch to kind of toggle things, set things like your heart rate, your breathing rate, your blood pressure, by trading off how active each of those two pieces of the autonomic nervous system is. So these different parts of your nervous system, you can see that they're also going different places. Right, so somatic nervous system is going to skeletal muscle, those named muscles attached to your skeleton. The autonomic nervous system, both the parasympathetics and the sympathetics, are going to smooth muscle, which we'll see in the walls of our blood vessels, among other places. Cardiac muscle, so the heart, as well as places like glands. So we'll see those when we get to the endocrine system and think about hormones. So So these are all places that you're not consciously thinking about making adjustments, but it's super important that they can adapt to your environment. That's our big picture view. We're gonna be zooming in on these different parts of the nervous system throughout our next unit, a little bit beyond. So if you ever get kind of lost about what we're talking about, I do recommend you come back to this picture and figure out where we are. So we're going to be diving deep on different types of receptors, different types of neurotransmitters. It's important to put this in the context of this big picture. And when you're just looking at words, at least I can get confused. I used to get confused, so no shame. You get confused as well. Reflecting on some of this, looking at that picture or thinking about what you know, I need you to tell me which part of this nervous system is going to be responsible for transmitting your sense of smell to the brain. Let's say you have a tasty breakfast, you got some bacon and smelling that. How are you getting that signal to the brain? Seconds. With this big map. Let's take a look. All right. So we're mostly on the same page here. Yes, it is your afferent fibers, those sensory nerves that would be able to sense using receptors, tasty chemicals in the air, and convey that information to your brain. So I like to remember the difference between afferent and efferent by first you gotta sense something and then you do something. Afferent starts with an A, first letter of the alphabet. Come up with your own tricks for these things. So those would be the afferent fibers. Different maps of the nervous system and different advanced textbooks might look a little different, but from my personal perspective regarding these other answers is when we're thinking about afferent nerves, we could divide them up into different groups, but I think just worthwhile to just view them all as afferent nerves, all sensory nerves as part of just like one big group. So all these other splits that we're thinking about are going to be splits within the motor part of our nervous system. So the efferent division is where we're going to see these different somatic versus autonomic, parasympathetic versus sympathetic parts. All right, so we're going to zoom in first to the autonomic nervous system because that's really kind of the most complicated part. So we want to devote plenty of time to it and make sure that we have plenty of time to go through all the details and make sure we are understanding what's going on. Right. So autonomic nervous system are our parasympathetics and our sympathetics. So we've got these two parts in the nervous system, and they're both going to the same effector organs. So you're going to see parasympathetic autonomic nerves and sympathetic autonomic nerves going to the same heart muscle, for example, right? So they're working in pretty much secrecy, right? You can measure your heart rate, but you're not thinking about it. Sometimes I think of autonomic as kind of the automatic part of your nervous system, things that are on kind of automatic control, although the word is autonomic, it is a little different, okay? And the parasympathetic and sympathetic innervation tend to have kind of opposite effects. So we're switching between these two parts of the autonomic nervous system if we want to like speed up versus slow down any given variable that we're trying to regulate. Make something more, make something less. So your parasympathetic nervous system, its function is often described as like rest and digest. You may have heard that before. So parasympathetics are the rest and digest in terms of their effects. So they're going to be involved usually with anything that slows you down, calms you down. You're sitting around digesting a bunch of food at rest. That's usually when you'll see the parasympathetic nervous system predominating. So it's going to be mostly in control during those times. Your sympathetic nervous system is therefore the opposite. So that's your fight or flight response. All that sympathetic stress, I like to associate that with stress because it's also an S, right? Tips and tricks. That fight or flight response coming from the sympathetic nervous system, usually, right? So anytime we're going to be speeding up, clenching, preparing to fight something or run away, it's usually going to have something to do with our sympathetic nerves. This is going to manage between these two systems lots and lots of unconscious processes. So we're going to be controlling all sorts of important organ systems through the actions of these two branches of the autonomic nervous system. You really can't maintain homeostasis without the autonomic nervous system. That's what ANS is an abbreviation for there. And so this is going to be responsible for things like blood pressure. So here we have a map. Okay? So when we say that there's dual innervation between the autonomic and parasympathetic nervous system, this is what we mean. So you can see here in the center, some of the organs, the effector organs, where we have these nerves going. So you can see we've got both sympathetics. Those are these ones over in green on your left, right? Sympathetic nerves over on this side, parasympathetic nerves over on this side. We can see that we've got pathways to the eye from each of those. We've got pathways to the lungs and the heart from each of these two parts of the autonomic nervous system, and so on and so forth down the line. Looking at all these organ systems, you can see that both the sympathetics and the parasympathetics are able to control or have an effect on these systems. Okay? You might also notice, though, that those nerves are coming from different places. So they're going to the same target organs, but we can see their full pathways. So we can see where they're coming from in this map as well. So you can see here, I'll have it out in words on a later slide, but you can see that all these sympathetic nerves are coming from the thorax and the lumbar region, the upper parts of the lumbar region. So what we're saying here is that those cell bodies for these nerves that are eventually going out to these organ systems, the first part of that chain is here in the spinal cord, basically in your chest and starting to get into your lower back, right? So that thoracolumbar region. That's where all those nerves are coming from, even if they have to travel up to your eye. That pathway is going to start down in your chest. The parasympathetics are starting in different places. So in our parasympathetics, we'll describe their origins as craniosacral. So we can see up here that we have parasympathetics originating at the brainstem, and we have way down at the bottom a limited number of parasympathetic nerves coming here from the sacrum, so exiting out the spinal cord through those sacral foramina down way at the bottom. So here in the thorax, the cervical region, the lumbar region, while we have organs nearby, the nerves from the parasympathetic division going to those organs have to travel quite a long distance. They're not coming out of the spinal cord right there nearby. taking a second to look at that diagram and our big map, I want you to tell me which of the following ways we might describe the cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve, correct. So more than one of these are true about the vagus nerve. A couple seconds to make your choices. Look. Okay, great. Yes. So on that diagram, on that previous page with the sympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, the origins of those nerves, you can see that our cranial nerves coming out of the brainstem, those ones you've been seeing in lab, right? They're part of the parasympathetic division. Yes. Because they're part of the parasympathetic division, that parasympathetic division is one of the parts of our autonomic nervous system, right? So we had autonomics, or ANS, dividing into parasympathetics and sympathetics, right? So it's from that first image, parasympathetic, sympathetic. Now, this last one is true that it's part of the peripheral nervous system. Maybe kind of surprising, right? Because it's up near the brain. But coming off of the brain, coming off of that brainstem, that is actually part of the peripheral nervous system. That is one of the main places we're going to see our parasympathetic nerves that form part of the autonomic division of the peripheral nervous system originating. Right, so cranial nerves are going out to the periphery. The vagus nerve especially goes really far. Vagus comes from the same word, it's like vagrant, right? It's a wanderer. And we're going to see that vagus nerve going all the way down to like our intestines, right? So it goes far out to the periphery from that origin on the brainstem. So they are also part of our peripheral nervous system when we're looking at all of these parasympathetic nerves and sympathetic nerves in our autonomic nervous system. Only things within the brain or the spinal cord itself, so located fully within, considered part of this nervous system. All right, that's our big picture. That's a lot of summary. Now we're going to dive in a little deeper. We're going to zoom in some more. Okay. So when we're zooming in further, we're gonna look at the autonomic nervous system, and we're gonna be looking at the specific pathways that those nerves are taking, okay? So we're gonna be looking at how they come out of the central nervous system and travel into the peripheral nervous system, and then eventually get to our effector organs. For our autonomic nerves, they're going to be cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, glands, as well as a little bit of adipose tissue to fat. So that's a less important for our purposes, but also happens to be true. Okay. So when we're describing these pathways, we're going to see that in our parasympathetic nervous system division versus our sympathetic nervous system division, we're going to have kind of different arrangements of which neuron is longer, where is its synapse with other neurons, how is it getting to those effector organs. So we're going to use some new, but hopefully relatively easy to understand terms as we kind of pick through that. Okay. So when we were talking about our nerves in our brain and stuff in our last unit, we were describing nerves as presynaptic or postsynaptic. This is basically the same kind of thing, except now we're thinking out in our peripheral nervous system. So we're going to be a little more specific, have a more specialized terminology here. So our preganglionic and postganglionic neurons are talking really about a pathway. Okay? So our preganglionic neuron, preganglionic means before the ganglia. So in our autonomic nervous system, we're going to see these structures called ganglia where we have collections of cell bodies, right? So this is where the synapse for this set of nerves would happen as well, right? So preganglionic neuron, before the ganglia. And our postganglionic neuron is then going to receive a signal, so synapsing here with that preganglionic neuron. Its body is in the autonomic ganglia. And then it's going to head out to the effector organs. So that's our postganglionic neuron. We're going to be focusing in the future on what neurotransmitter is the preganglionic neuron produce. What neurotransmitter is the postganglionic neuron produce? What type of receptor do we have on the postganglionic neuron? What type of receptor do we have on the effector organ, etc. So important to know these words so that we can understand what we're talking about when we're diving into those things. So preganglionic, postganglionic, pretty much the same thing, just in a different place as presynaptic, postsynaptic. So the autonomic ganglia are where you would have those synapses happening. There are some intrinsic neurons, so some neurons that like kind of just exist inside here. We're not going to really worry about those ones, honestly, in this unit. Okay. And then our effector organs are the parts of the body that actually have an effect on whatever thing we're trying to regulate. So blood pressure, breathing, heart rate, etc. Hormones. Okay. When we're zooming in on the sympathetic nervous system, it's just half of that picture we saw before. So we're looking at neurons. Our preganglionic neurons are going to originate in the thoracolumbar section of the spinal cord. So thoraco for thorax, lumbar for lumbar, right? So it's just referring to the fact that these nerves are coming out of the spinal cord from T1 to L2, right? So that's where they would start with the body for that preganglionic neuron. Be somewhere in there. And on future images, we're going to see a little cross section of the spinal cord. So these next 2 points refer to that. I would consider this lower priority information, but you'll see it mentioned periodically. So they're going to be coming from specific regions within the spinal cord in cross section called the lateral horn, even more specifically, the interomedial cell column. But that's just part of the anatomy of the spinal cord, right? So we can start to generalize about what a pathway would look like when we're thinking about a sympathetic nerve. Okay? So say we want to go out to the heart. So we're going to end this A&P1 course with the heart, so we might as well use it as an example. Okay? So a way you might get a pathway to the heart for the sympathetic nervous system, have a relatively short preganglionic neuron here, goes to a structure called the sympathetic chain. So the sympathetic chain is something that you might even see in lab next semester. It's going to be this long sort of white cord lying alongside the spine. What it is a bunch of like basically beads of linked ganglia here. So the sympathetic chain is this location where we have our preganglionic neurons from the sympathetic nervous system go in, and they can travel up and down this kind of side chain to change what level of the body they're at. So you can see here, to get up into the head to the eye, we had a nerve coming from T1, so that first thoracic vertebra went into the sympathetic chain, but it went all the way up to the cervical region, so up your neck, so that the postganglionic neuron here, traveling to the eye, didn't have quite as far to go. Okay. So we can move up and down levels within that sympathetic chain. All right, so tracing to the heart, usually we will see something like a short preganglionic neuron. This is hopefully the one I circled before, I think. All right. Then we're going to have a longer postganglionic neuron after that sympathetic chain, heading out to the effector organ. So we can trace this one going all the way to the heart like that. All right. So a shorter preganglionic neuron with synapse in the ganglia of the sympathetic chain, and then head out onto a long postganglionic neuron going to its effector organ. This is going to be a difference compared to the route for our parasympathetic nerves. Okay, so this is the most common way we're going to have those sympathetic nerves traveling. So we do have some exceptions. Right. So up here, we're looking at that most common route. Right, so we see lots of our sympathetic nerves have that short preganglionic neuron from, here's a picture of that lateral horn, right? So it's just part of this spinal cord. Okay. Right. So coming out, short preganglionic neuron to that sympathetic chain, then a longer postganglionic neuron out to whatever effector organ we're going to. Okay. However, we do have some places where we're going to have sympathetic nerves go into those organs, but they're going to skip that sympathetic chain. So if we skip the sympathetic chain, we might still have a sympathetic nerve if it's one of these two types. Okay. So I'm going to jump down to this third picture first, because that's a picture of a collateral ganglion. Okay. So collateral, think about it just as like extra outside. So it's still a ganglion. It's just not in the sympathetic chain. So we'll have some collateral ganglia kind of scattered throughout the body, where we have a limited number of sympathetic nerves synapsing. So in this case, our preganglionic neuron would go synapse in this collateral ganglion with a postganglionic neuron going out to the effector organ. In this case, you might see a longer preganglionic neuron than you did when you were just going to the sympathetic chain. Okay? So that length of the neuron can change in this arrangement. The really special place that we're also going to see sympathetic nerves is when we're thinking about your adrenal glands. Okay? So we're going to think extensively about your adrenal glands when we think about hormones and stress. We're going to pair that with understanding our sympathetic nervous system, because the adrenal glands are complex and they're doing a lot of different things in a lot of different ways. So we'll get to them in the future. But one of the things going on in our adrenal glands is we've got sympathetic innervation. Okay. So here in this diagram, we can see a preganglionic neuron going out to the center of an adrenal gland. So the adrenal medulla is that inside part of the adrenal gland. And fun fact, your adrenal glands sit right on top of your kidneys, if you're wondering where we are. So adrenal, renal is a word we'll use for kidneys. So kind of tells you where they are. They're near the kidney, on top of the kidney. So adrenal gland, you slice open adrenal glands, we're gonna have like a shell and then a gooey center. So the shell is the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla is this inside part. Okay. So we're going to be talking about these two parts separately, the cortex versus the medulla. So I'm telling you that the sympathetic innervation is going on in that adrenal medulla. So in the middle medulla, in the center here of that adrenal gland, we have those preganglionic neurons synapsing with something called chromaffin cells. So chromaffin cells are basically modified postganglionic sympathetic neurons, okay? They're not going anywhere though. They're just kind of staying in the adrenal medulla. So they've undergone some changes, right, in shape. We're not going to have a long axon going somewhere else, right? They're just here in the adrenal medulla, chromaffin cells. So in the adrenal medulla, those chromaffin cells are going to release three types of catecholamines. So essentially three types of neurotransmitters that are also kind of going to act as hormones in your body. And these are going to be the same neurotransmitters and hormones that we see associated with our sympathetic nervous system throughout. So when we think about sympathetic nerves, you're going to be thinking a lot about epinephrine and norepinephrine. Also sometimes referred to as adrenaline and noradrenaline, right? Those are just different terms. Fortunately, locally we talk about epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay. And they also produce a little bit of dopamine as well, actually, similar compound here. So from that adrenal medulla, specifically, 80% of what they're producing is epinephrine. 20%-ish of what they're producing is norepinephrine. And that'll be relevant when we start to talk about receptors for the sympathetic nervous system that are going to react differently to epinephrine versus norepinephrine. Here's just a zoomed in picture, bigger picture of those three routes that we can take if we're a sympathetic nerve. Okay, so our first most common route, we've got preganglionic neuron to the sympathetic chain, postganglionic neuron to the effector organ. We've got another route specifically to the adrenal glands. So preganglionic neuron to the adrenal medulla. Our preganglionic neuron is then synapsing on a chromaffin cell, which is releasing probably epinephrine, maybe norepinephrine, right? Little amounts of both. And then our third way we can have our arrangement of our sympathetic nerves is we can have a collateral ganglion, so a ganglion somewhere not in the sympathetic chain, still got a preganglionic neuron going to that ganglion, then a postganglionic neuron out to the effector organs. So, zooming in further on that sympathetic chain, this is mostly in here because I believe you spoke about this in Phys Lab at some point. Is that true? You want to raise your hand? Have you seen some of this stuff in Phys Lab? Phys Lab changes over the years, so I don't know if it's still in there. Okay. I will treat this as new then. Okay. So, okay, so if we're looking at these sympathetic nerves, these are still sympathetic nerves. This is showing that most common route, but in a different, more zoomed in version. So our preganglionic neuron be in that thoracolumbar region, so T1 to L2, when we're thinking about the numbered vertebrae. And it's in that lateral horn, the intermedial cell column, here in cross section of our spinal cord. It's gonna come out a region of the spinal cord exit. It's gonna come out on the belly side, basically. Ventral in anatomy means like belly side, right? So our preganglionic neuron is coming out the ventral root of the spinal cord. So our ventral root would be kind of like anterior. Okay. Then going to enter a spinal nerve. Okay. So a spinal nerve is what you would have coming out between your vertebrae, right? So when we see those gaps, our spinal nerves in the lateral sides of our articulated vertebral column, that's what we're looking at, right? So come onto a spinal nerve, okay? And then it's gonna jump onto that sympathetic chain. So this light blue bit here, showing how that happens, right? So that sympathetic preganglionic nerve jumping on the sympathetic chain, something called the white ramus, right? So this is the white ramus, we have myelin on it, and it's white ramus into the sympathetic chain. That's where it's going to synapse with our postganglionic neuron. That postganglionic neuron then jumps off the sympathetic chain at some point, could travel up or down, but eventually it gets back onto that spinal nerve by a gray ramus, and then the spinal nerve takes it out to an effector organ. When we look at spinal nerves, they have a lot of mixing of the different types of neurons, different divisions of our nervous system in them. And this is part of how that happens. So this is a little piece of what's going on there. So this is just a pathway. This is just showing you how we have those nerves communicating and physically traveling. Okay, so those postganglionic nerves are then leaving the ganglia in the sympathetic chain as a gray ramus and re-entering that spinal nerve, going out to the effector organ. In our collateral ganglia, we have a similar sort of route, but we would not go into the sympathetic chain. Instead, we would go out to collateral. Okay. So this is different than the pathway for our parasympathetic nerves. Fortunately, the sympathetic nerves are the ones that are much more complicated. So we've gotten the hard part out of the way. The sympathetic nerves have lots of complicated routes. They go into a sympathetic chain, et cetera, et cetera. Parasympathetic nerves are pretty simple. Our parasympathetic nerves, you're going to start either in the brainstem or in that sacral spinal cord. So we might have a cranial nerve, or we might have essentially a pelvic nerve for our parasympathetic nerves. They're just going to have a nice long preganglionic neuron. And they're going to get real close to their effector organs. They'll have a little ganglion. And then a little postganglionic neuron right there. That's really good. Long preganglionic neuron, little ganglion somewhere near the effector organ, notably a very short postganglionic neuron. That's it for the pathway. No additional structures we need to think about if we're thinking about a parasympathetic nerve. So looking at those parasympathetic nerves, you have physically seen some already. So some of your cranial nerves carry parasympathetic innervation, not all of them. Okay? So we're not going to go into super detailed details about every cranial nerve and exactly what it does and how, but fundamentally, some of them are just doing like sensory stuff or controlling muscles, but a couple of them carry this special type of innervation, autonomic nerve, this innervation specifically parasympathetic innervation. So those are going to be Cranial nerve 10, our vagus nerve. Cranial nerve 3, our oculomotor nerve. Cranial nerve 7, our facial nerve. And cranial nerve 9, our glossopharyngeal nerve. So when we say this means that each of these nerves are going to be going to something like a gland, something like a different organ system, and having a sort of complex regulatory autonomic effects on that effector organ, versus our other cranial nerves either doing just special sensory stuff or just touch sensation and just muscles. So limited number of cranial nerves involved in parasympathetic innervation, but super important that cranial nerves do produce parasympathetic innervation. Okay. Then we have our sacral nerves as well. It's possible to have a sacral nerve with parasympathetic innervation. So going to the genitalia, bladder, and rectum, we have kind of like a dividing point around here. All right, so everything essentially up to your small intestine is coming from the brainstem, from those cranial nerves, and everything below is coming from those sacral nerves. Okay. So we are going to have very specific spinal nerves coming from the sacrum that carry parasympathetics. They're different and not really mixed in with somatic spinal nerves, but we're not going to go into any of those. All right, so that's where we're going to leave this for today. Next time we'll start talking about neurotransmitters and receptors. But recommendation, just if we're going into neurotransmitters and receptors and stuff, this table, if it's the first time you see it when we talk about it in class, is going to be a lot, but it really summarizes almost everything we're going to be talking about when we think about receptors and neurotransmitters and stuff for the sympathetic specifically. So I would take a glance at it ahead of time. You don't have to totally understand it. We're talking about it, but